Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Data Playbook. This is going to be for the 4 o'clock games, doing the same reviews that I did earlier, so let's get right into it. First up for the 4 o'clock games, we have Denver at the Chargers. So, looking at the details of this game, you have the Chargers favored on the money line with a spread of 2.5 and a total line of 45.5 total points. So, going through the details and starting before, like I did with the defense, the Broncos have 9.5 average quarterback hits and 4.5 average pass defended. No interceptions yet. Whereas the Chargers defense has 6.5 average QB hits, 1.5 average interceptions, and 9.5 passes defended. They have 2.5 sacks here, with 3.5 average for the Broncos. So they both have pretty good defenses in their own way. It will really depend, I think, if the Broncos can rush Herbert. Because right now you have the Chargers at 4 for their passing rank, which is again the absolute added up value of the total yards and just ranking the teams based on that. So you have 280 average passing yards for Herbert. And for the rushing information, you have an average of 85.5 rushing yards. You have a couple sacks suffered on average per game, where there's only about one suffered on an average per game for the Broncos. They have thrown a few interceptions for the Broncos, but they have 191 average passing yards per game. And the Broncos have 134.5 average rushing yards per game. And now looking at the quarterbacks matched up, we have Bo Nix with 3 passing interceptions, but only 1 sack suffered this year. He did fumble in a sack, but managed to recover it. Over here for Justin Herbert, you have no interceptions, 5 sacks suffered though, and 2 rushing fumbles that he's lost one of them. He averages 8 carries for 31.5 yards, and Bo does 5.5 carries for 19 yards. And finally, you have Herbert with an average of 280 passing yards, and Bo with an average of 191. Bo improved over his second week from 176 to 206. Herbert kind of fell, but at the same time, 318 to 242, that's still great numbers. So I think that if the Broncos want to win this game, they're going to have to make sure that they shut down the passing game from Justin Herbert. So since there's not as many games to go through, I'm going to also look at probably the primary receivers and running backs. So here we have J.K. Dobbins and Hampton. Across the board, neither of them have lost any fumbles to anything. You do have Dobbins with significantly more fantasy points, which should be reflected in how many rushing yards. So J.K. Dobbins has 69.5 average rushing yards per game, averages 7 receiving yards per game, as does Hampton, but he only averages 36 average rushing yards per game. If we look at this through the last couple weeks, you had 63 and 76 for J.K. Dobbins, and 48 and 24 for Hampton. And for fun, since Najee Harris has been getting quite a bit, you have him averaging 16.5 yards per game, averages a little bit more receiving yards with 12.5. His rushing yards went 5 to 28, so it does look like they're giving him a little bit more looks, took a little away from Hampton. This might become more of a committee kind of style running back game. So hopefully that gives you some insight to the Chargers running backs there. And here we just have kind of the top receivers for each one, although the Chargers have several weapons like Keenan Allen and Quentin Johnson, who are also potentially top-level wide receivers. So hard to say exactly who the top receiver is. I hope that eventually I can have a breakdown where I have 2 or 3 of these where I can see all the receivers at once. Down here, his air yard share is probably second highest, third highest. What is that? Probably Keenan Allen at 24% and Quentin Johnson at 34%. So he gets the third most air yards share of the whole team. Over here, you have Sutton with 41% of the air yard share. So he's by far the favorite in terms of farther passes and everything. Sutton has had only 33.5 average receiving yards on the Broncos so far, versus McConkley, who has had 61 on average receiving yards per game. All right, for fun, I also brought up Troy Franklin and Quentin Johnson just to kind of see. It does look like these are 2 of the larger. I mean, he has the largest air yard share on the LA Chargers. Over here with Troy Franklin, he's probably the second largest share of actual reception yards So he's receiving 66.5 receiving yards on average per game, which is about double of what Cortland Sutton's getting. And Quentin Johnson over here is getting 75 on average yards per a game. So since it's only been 2 games, let's look at the receiving yards. Quentin Johnson's really averaged that 79, 71. Looks like Troy Franklin's kind of coming up in the ranks where he's got 44 the first game, but 89 the second game. So it'll be interesting to see if that continues with the Broncos. This is all I have for now for the Broncos at the Chargers. We'll move on to the next game, which is New Orleans at Seattle. So for the New Orleans at Seattle game, your money line heavily favors Seattle over New Orleans. The spread is 7.5, with the total point line at 41.5. Going through some of the rankings, you have New Orleans at a little under average with the passing rank at 24, the rushing rank at 13 right in the middle. You kind of have Seattle just under average with the passing rank at 18 and the rushing rank at 19. So this kind of comes out where there's 210 average passing yards per game for New Orleans, 225 average passing yards per game for Seattle. They both exceed 100 rushing yards per game on average, with New Orleans at 114, Seattle at 100. Seattle's averaged 1 passing interception per game this season, whereas there have been no passing interceptions from New Orleans. Look at the defense. New Orleans averages 4 sacks a game, whereas Seattle only averages 2 sacks per game. You have 2 interceptions on average from Seattle, but none from New Orleans. And our QB hits are 5.5 on average per game for New Orleans and 8 on average for Seattle. So for our quarterback comparison, we have Spencer Rattler and Sam Darnold. Rattler this season has suffered 4 sacks, but no interceptions or fumbles that were actually lost. Whereas Sam Darnold has had 2 passing interceptions and 3 sacks suffered, as well as a lost fumble. He does average 225 passing yards per game and 7 rushing yards per game. Looking at these numbers for the past 2, he had 150 passing yards in the first game and 295 in the second game. So it did look like he improved, even though interceptions came from the second game. Over here, you had a more consistent 214 and 206 each week, with an average of 210, and Rattler averages 21.5 rushing yards per game. And this gives Rattler a slight edge in fantasy points. And now looking at our primary running backs, Kenneth Walker has lost no fumbles, but Alvin Kamara has lost 1 receiving fumble this year. Alvin Kamara averages 72.5 rushing yards per game, whereas Kenneth Walker averages 62.5. Alvin Kamara averages 16.5 receiving yards as well, and Kenneth Walker only with 8.5. If you look at the rushing yards broken down by game, Alvin Kamara had not a great first game with 45 rushing yards, but 1 touchdown. Second game, 100 rushing yards, no touchdown. Kenneth Walker actually has something very similar, where he only got 20 rushing yards in the first game, but 105 in the second with a rushing touchdown. And similar with the receiving yards. A little increase, but not much. About the same for both. And for our primary receivers, we have Chris Olave and Smith Ninjaba. Jackson's had 2 receiving fumbles and lost 1 of them, whereas Olave has not lost any of them. If we look at their averages, Olave has 35.5 average receiving yards per game, whereas Jackson has almost double that at 113.5 average receiving yards per game. If we look down here, Jackson has the largest share by far of the air receiving yards, and same goes with Olave over here for his team. And if we break it down by week, Olave is very consistent with 54-53, and Jackson's pretty similar with 103 and 124 receiving yards. Kind of a good over 100 average. Our next matchup is Dallas at Chicago. Here you have a pretty close game with the money line with Dallas, but just barely. You have your spread at 1.5, and what's projected to be a higher scoring game than average at 49.5 total points. So here you have Dallas a little higher all around between their passing rank at 7, their rushing rank at 11, and the Bears are sitting about in the middle with the passing rank a little under average at 19 and a rushing rank at 12. So this gives, on average, Dallas has 274.5 passing yards. They average 127 rushing yards per game. They've had 1 interception in the last 2 games that they've had. If we look at the Bears, they have 220 passing yards on average per game, and an average of 126.5 rushing yards per game. They too have had one interception this season. If we look at the defensive side, you have quarterback hits with 5.5 and 4.5 for the Bears. So similar there. They each have gotten an interception this season. The pass defended is not as good on Dallas's side, especially compared to the average, I think, across all of the NFL, with the Bears being a little better at 2.5. They have gotten a defensive touchdown as well. I think that's the first one I've seen of all the one I've done today. They both average 1.5 sacks per game. I think that's about all that we'll pull out of this panel. If we go into the quarterback details, we have that Dak threw one passing interception, has had 3 sacks suffered this year, and he had a rushing fumble that he did not lose. Similarly, Caleb Williams has 1 passing interception, 6 sacks suffered, so he's getting beat up a little bit more. He averages 208.5 passing yards per game, whereas Dak averages 274.5 passing yards per game. Dak averages 10 yards rushing per game, but Caleb Williams has 42.5 average rushing yards per game. Just the breakdown by game, the first game, Dak only had 188 passing yards, second game 361, so that average is definitely pulled up by the last game that they had against the Giants. Unlike Dak, Caleb Williams is a lot more consistent, right around that 200 mark of passing. Caleb also averages a little higher passing touchdowns per game than Dak does at this moment. This is also seen in the fact that Dak has less fantasy points this season than the total that Caleb Williams does. And taking a closer look at the running back, you have Williams and Swift here. Swift has lost 1 fumble this year. Williams has not. Williams has been on a bit of a tear in terms of fantasy points, having 45.5 versus 23.5 for Swift. So looking at their averages, you have Williams with 75.5 average rushing yards, with Swift at 58 on average rushing yards per game. You also have Williams averaging 21.5 receiving yards, whereas Swift only averages 9. If we look at this in detail, the first week, Williams only got 54 rushing yards, but the second week he had 97, but he made up for a bunch of that in receiving yards, I believe. If we look over here at Swift, he had 53 and 63, a little bit more consistent, but on the lower side consistent. That's not exactly what we want to see. And looking at the top receivers, we have CeeDee Lamb and DJ Moore. So as we can see, CeeDee Lamb has the highest air yard share, which makes sense how he, with his speed and position and how he's always going out for long balls. Over here you have DJ Moore, who is not the largest air yard share. I think it's actually Rome here. Maybe we can take a look at that real fast here in a second. But if we look at their season averages so far, you have CeeDee Lamb with like 18-ish more points in PPR, about 10 more in non-PPR formats. He has 111 average receiving yards, very consistent with 110 and 112 for the past 2 games. Over here you have 57 average receiving yards per game for DJ Moore. Only averages 4 receptions versus CD's 8 receptions, with 12 targets on average versus the 5.5 targets on average. Once again, we can see it's 13-11 for CeeDee Lamb. Over here we have 5-6, and he had 68 receiving yards the first game, 46 the second. So this may not be your top receiver, even though he's listed as your number 1 receiver. So if we look at Rome Oduns, I think is how you say his name. Hopefully I said that right. But if we look at his season average and his fantasy points, they're higher than CeeDee Lamb's actually. 47 PPR to 38.2 PPR. Here you have receiving yards averaging 82.5 with 6.5 receptions on average. It does look like a lot of this came from the last game. He only had 37 reception yards in the first game, and then the second game 128. So he did pretty spectacular the second game. Similar targets. So if he just keeps picking up more of those targets, this could be more consistent in the future. 2 receiving touchdowns, averaged at least 1.5 touchdowns per game. So that's pretty good for a receiver to get that kind of consistency. But I think that's all I got here. And for the final 4 o'clock games, we have Arizona at San Francisco. So for Arizona at San Francisco, you have Arizona slightly favored, but again, another very close one with a spread of only 1.5 and a total point line of 44.5. Looking at this in detail, you have the Cardinals actually a little lower ranked. I'd say overall that the Cardinals are slightly lower ranked with a passing rank of 26 out of all 32 teams in the NFL and a rushing rank of 14. Here you have San Francisco with a passing rank of 6 and a rushing rank of 22. Kind of surprising for McCaffrey and for Purdy being out. But if we do look at the averages, you have 278 average passing yards per game, which is right up there. You only have 98 rushing yards per game, which is actually, I'd say, pretty decent, but still puts them a little lower. Over here, you have 114 average rushing yards per game and 191.5 average passing yards per game. On average, San Francisco has thrown 1 interception a game, and the Cardinals have thrown 1 interception all season. If we look at the hits, there's 3.5 QB hits on average per game from San Francisco, 6 on average from the Cardinals. The Cardinals have gotten 1 interception all season. They have an average of 9.5 passes defended per game, which is pretty good, with only 3 on San Francisco. They both average 2 sacks a game, while San Francisco has forced more fumbles. If we look into the quarterback matchup, you know that you have Mac Jones since Purdy's out. Mac Jones only played in week 2, but had 279 passing yards, which does come out to be his average, so the total season is what we want to look at here. He had 3 passing touchdowns in that game. Did suffer all 3 sacks suffered from, did lose a fumble. He also had 6 carries for 6 yards. Over here with Kyler Murray, he's had 1 interception, suffered 6 sacks in 2 games, so on the same average as Mac Jones. He has an average of 191.5 passing yards and an average of 35 rushing yards a game. So it does look like he suffered all 5 sacks in the first game, with 1 in the second game. So that's an improvement. Hopefully they continue that way. Passing yards were 163 and 220. So a little bit more of an improvement there, although he had 2 passing touchdowns in the first game. Looking at his rushing, that's pretty even with the carries and everything. So that's pretty consistent. Looking at our starting running backs, we have James Conner and McCaffrey. McCaffrey having the higher season PPR total. Both of them have no fumbles to show for the season yet. You have James Conner averaging 36.5 rushing yards and averaging 11.5 receiving yards. And you have McCaffrey averaging 62 rushing yards per game and 62.5 receiving yards per game. So this is a big PPR one, right? That's why 15 points higher in PPR. It really gives McCaffrey a boost through his receiving yards and receptions. If we look at their weekly breakdown, we have 69 rushing yards and 55 for McCaffrey. And you have 39 and 34, a little bit more consistent, but much lower on the scale of what you want to see from your primary running back. Receiving yards over here, 5 and 18. That makes sense with an average of 11.5, so nothing that's significantly different there. With McCaffrey, you have 73 and 52 receiving yards with 9 and 6 receptions. So big receiving running back, really helpful in PPR if that's what you need. And if we look at the receivers at the top level, the very top receivers, without going through them all, you have Juan Jennings. Who's out for this week and maybe longer. I'm not sure what his actual status is, but he's listed as the number 1 wide receiver for San Francisco. So we go to Ricky Pearsall, who's the second highest ranked wide receiver active right now. So Marvin Harrison has 22.8 fantasy PPR points, while Ricky has 24, so he's even doing better than the number 1 receiver on Arizona. You have Marvin Harrison Jr. receiving yards 49 on average per game. Ricky's average is 82 receiving yards per game, so Ricky might be even kind of the primary wide receiver right now. So Ricky had 108 receiving yards the first week, 56 the second week, with 4 receptions on both. Comparing to Marvin Harrison Jr., 5 receptions, 2 receptions, similar targets, couldn't bring them in, I guess. Only had 71 rushing yards in the first game, but only 27 in the second game. So not a great trend. They need to get him more involved, hopefully. But yeah, this is the top level receivers that we have. This could be a mix-up with so many people out, with Kittle still out, with Purdy still out. It's hard to say what San Francisco's receivers look like just yet without a few more weeks of the new of getting Mac Jones throwing to them. And with all of that, that's all the afternoon 4 o'clock games. I hope that you all enjoyed. Leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more. Leave a comment if you want to see something more specific, if you have somebody that you want to see every single time, or if there's some information on teams that you want that are more specific. Just let me know in the comments. Let me know what you like, what you dislike, and we'll continue to improve this. But with that, thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you next time.